Good morning, everyone. This is our first podcast for the Asia Society Korea. And today we have a special guest, Professor Mason Richey, who is a professor of international relations at the Hanguk University of Foreign Studies here in Korea. His area of specialization includes international security, EU politics, international organizations, and he's written a lot of articles on North Korea, and he also specializes in the field of cyber security. So today, the theme of our podcast is digital diplomacy in politics. Therefore, we've asked Professor Richie to come here today so we can ask him a few questions and discuss about this interesting topic. Zumaro, would you like to go first?
All right, so thank you very much for Jevon to introduce our distinguished speaker today, and thank you so much for Professor Richey to come to our podcast. And to keep our conversation today, we would like to focus on the digital diplomacy. So, how can digital tools and social media impact international relations and diplomacy in modern world, according to your perspective?
So first of all, thanks for having me. I'm obviously really happy to be here, and I'm happy to speak with you, and I'm honored to be your first guest. How can digital diplomacy affect international relations in the contemporary world? So I think I would start by putting on my professor hat for just a moment and say perhaps something about where diplomacy fits into international relations and into international security. So we talk in many cases in terms of national power, um, in terms of a set of capacities that states have, which sort of aggregate together the amount of power that they have, and therefore their ability to push forward the interests of their state, to influence the international system, to make changes in international affairs, or conversely, if states aren't very powerful, to be subjected to that and to be vulnerable to other states. So we sometimes talk about this model of national power as what we call DIMEFIL. So DIMEFIL. And the D, as you might imagine, stands for diplomacy. So we usually talk in terms of diplomacy, information, military, economic, legal, was DIMEF, finance, and L for legal, and intelligence is the other I. So, diplomacy is one of the tools of national power. And, traditionally we think of diplomacy in terms of the number of embassies or missions abroad that a state has. You might talk about the number of diplomats that a state has, whether those be posted abroad or whether those be the diplomats that are at home in a Ministry of Foreign Affairs. You might talk about the power of having a language, which is the diplomatic language. So, for instance, for a long time, it was on the international scene, it was French, or perhaps regionally, historically, it might have been Chinese. Here in East Asia, of course, now English is as much as any other the working diplomatic language across most of the planet. So, diplomacy in a sort of traditional context, is how we typically think of it. And obviously, digital diplomacy is a relatively new development. So, where does that fit into the picture? I think I would say, first of all, the answer to that question partially depends on our definition of what we mean by digital diplomacy. And so different states and different scholars and experts have different definitions. It can include the use of information networks and digitized media as a way to broaden a state's or deepen a state's influence. That's, of course, an extremely broad definition. Other states, for instance, the UK, focus on a definition that is quite simple, but perhaps obscures more than it clarifies, and that is the use of the internet in solving international problems and in meeting the needs of international affairs. So obviously it depends on the definition, but I think kind of regardless of how we look at the definition, I think we can say at least a few things that are useful. And so one is that digital diplomacy taken in the sense of the actual networks that exist, so the actual physical infrastructure of the internet and of information that passes through it, the data that passes through it. Among other things, what it means today is that diplomacy acts at a much, much more rapid pace than it ever did before. And therefore, the information that is passed from state to state through official diplomatic channels or through public diplomacy that is digitized obviously happens much more rapidly than it did before and covers a much, much larger area. So you have both an increase in informational throughput at the same time that you also have a much broader stream of information covering a much more comprehensive set of areas. And so this means that, of course, we have more information, but it also means we have more information to sift through, right? If you're diplomats, if you are working in a government somewhere and you're trying to make sense of the world and of your state's place in it, you have obviously much more information to help you do that, but you also have a much larger pile of information from which you have to abstract that which is important and that which is relevant for whatever decision making that you're engaged in or whatever policy making you want to do. So I think that's one place to start. I think a second place to start, of course, is that digital diplomacy opens up direct connections, not only from government to government in new formats, but obviously in terms of at least one part of what we call public diplomacy, governments to people. So in particular, you can think about how a government might use Twitter or Facebook or a web page in order to put out a comment about events, in order to provide their take or their understanding of something that's happening about world affairs, to comment on interstate relations, whether those be friendly and supportive comments or whether those be critical comments. And not only are those, of course, directed from government to government in terms of public diplomacy, but also from one government to peoples of other states. And so you can imagine, obviously, ministries of foreign affairs and ministers of foreign affairs who tweet, diplomats, notably ambassadors in particular, who in the name of their state make tweets quite frequently, whether that be the Chinese ambassador here in Korea or the US ambassador here in Korea or the US ambassador in China or the French ambassador in Washington. The former one, Jevon, was, for instance, quite notorious or some might say quite interesting in terms of his use of Twitter very frequently to be in his estimation, I think, an honest broker about what he thought was happening in world affairs, but that was sometimes seen as being relatively critical of the United States in a way that might not fit into traditional expectations of how diplomats are supposed to act. Thirdly, I think another way that we see digital diplomacy making a difference in international affairs today is obviously we can do many more interesting things with the multimedia possibilities that digitization afford us, whether those be putting out videos, and again, those can be quite positive and uplifting. They can also be quite negative, as we just saw recently with Russia, which put out some images of sort of imagined nuclear strike on New York and San Francisco, right? So you can these days make statements using multimedia, notably imagery, video, film, that sort of thing, which wasn't really possible before. And that can be uplifting and can be supportive from one state to another. It can be effective. It can also, of course, be destructive. It can be threatening. And so it cuts both ways in that sense. I think, that would largely fall under the rubric of what we call soft power, right? It's a way for states, to become more attractive to other states, or in some cases more repulsive to other states. And that largely falls into the rubric of soft power. So digital diplomacy fits into soft power in some way. And I guess I'll say just sort of two last things. The next one is there's obviously a cybersecurity dimension to this. And the more that states engage in digital diplomacy, and the more that the backbone of their ability to advance their state's interest depends on digital tools, means that those states are therefore increasing the attack surface that they represent to other states who might have malicious intent, whether that be through influence operations or hacking or other tools. The advantages of digitization and information networks, of course, bring with them negatives too, in terms of the increase in attack surface for malicious cyber actors. And the last thing I'll say is ultimately we shouldn't forget that Marshall McLuhan be damned, the medium isn't always the message, and that sometimes the message itself also matters. Actually, you guys, I realize, are probably not too young to understand who Marshall McLuhan is, but go back and read your media studies. We have this famous phrase that dates back, I believe, to the 1970s, with a media theorist named Marshall McLuhan, who once said, "The medium is the message," basically talking about, in some sense, how superficial life had become. And of course, now we live in an age which, compared to the 1970s, is even more superficial, with TikTok and whatever other types of inanities exist out there. But I'll get off my old person soapbox for just a second and simply say, I think that ultimately the tools of digital diplomacy are only as valuable as the strategy underlying them, right? States, in order to advance their national interest, have to have a strategy for doing so. Simply tweeting, simply having a social media presence isn't enough. Rather, those are digital diplomacy tools which can be used to advance your national interest if the strategy behind that is solid, and if the digital diplomacy into which that fits into that strategy is solid. So you have to have a message that works, and you have to have a message that is coherent and that works together with your larger national strategy. It doesn't matter what your digital diplomatic tools are ultimately if you're not using them in a way that's strategic and with messaging that is tailored to that larger strategy.
Thank you. Very interesting. So I have a question kind of related to what you mentioned on soft power, because in the context of the Korean Peninsula, North Korea rejects South Korean soft power. So in this context of the Korean Peninsula, how can digital diplomacy contribute to maintaining regional security and stability?
Well, this is a complicated question, and it to some degree depends perhaps on the where you're sitting, or where you're standing. So just to give you one way, of course, if we think back to the pandemic period, the COVID-19 pandemic period, it was still completely possible for leaders and senior officials, mid-level officials in Washington, Seoul, Tokyo, even Beijing, Moscow, to speak with each other. And they were able to do that, of course, through video conferencing. And obviously, we've had video conferencing for, even pre-digital eras, right? Back when, you could do, other forms of conferencing. But in the sort of contemporary digital era, it's become much easier, much cheaper, much more reliable to be able to do much more accessible, for governments to be able to do video conferencing. So obviously, if we think back to the pandemic era, it was possible for Washington and Seoul and Tokyo to coordinate not only on the pandemic but also on other regional issues, whether that be China or North Korea. So I think that's one area. Another area, of course, is, as I've sort of hinted at in my last answer, cultural exchange builds thick relations between nations. And so, the more that South Korea and Japan and the United States, the more that, South Korea, Japan, United States, Taiwan, we could also add in the Philippines and Australia and Singapore and other countries as well. The more that they, produce, cultural content that fits into, public cultural diplomacy, means that you have thicker people-to-people relations, on the back of which that goodwill produces, or can lead to, at least in principle, better government-to-government relations. And this is a sort of interdependence thesis that comes right out of traditional liberal international versions of international relations. So I think that those are two ways that digital diplomacy play a role in the region, in addition to the other things that I've already talked about in my first response. Another way, this is perhaps a bit less obvious and doesn't perhaps fit exactly into your question, but I think it's important, is that, as information has become much more democratized, we now have open source intelligence experts, who have access to satellite imagery that is as good today as what governments had probably 20 years ago, which means in open source intelligence experts can now keep governments somewhat more honest in terms of the narrative that they give with respect to, for instance, shipments of oil or other raw materials, let's say to North Korea or from North Korea, that might break sanctions, or shipments of weapons from or to North Korea that again are violations of sanctions. We can get imagery of North Korea testing testing engines for its rockets and missiles. We can get imagery of Chinese nuclear silo fields, out in the rural areas of China. So open source intelligence experts, now can task satellites to be able to give them these images, which they then diffuse through digital means. And that, first of all, just brings more information out into the public sphere. And secondly, it helps keeps governments honest. They can't say, at least as easily, things that are obviously and incredibly falsified. They also can't as easily hide information and not say things that they might prefer not to say as well. So I think that plays a role perhaps in stabilizing. The more information is out there in the general public, the easier it is to sort of keep tabs on governments, and all things being equal, that keeps them somewhat more honest. You could look at this from the other side too and say, well, North Korea, right? They also have their way perhaps of thinking about this. And North Korea uses digital tools as well. They produce some quite stylish and striking videos when they test or demonstrate certain rockets and missiles. They do so in a quite calculating fashion. And I think that quite calculating fashion is intended to send a deterrence message to South Korea, the United States, and Japan, right? Not to attack North Korea. Now, we perhaps, let's say in the US or even among conservatives in South Korea or in Japan, might not be very excited about the prospect of being deterred by North Korea, right? All countries like to deter other countries, but don't like to be deterred themselves. That's one of the fundamental rules of deterrence. But at the end of the day, deterrence is a two-way street. And North Korea is also deterring the United States, South Korea, and Japan from potentially attacking North Korea. And I don't know about you, but I actually think that it's good, probably, that we don't have that happen, given North Korea's capabilities in both the nuclear and conventional domain. So, there's a certain way of looking at North Korea's use of digital tools that you can actually see, functioning diplomatically as a message pathway for deterrence that could actually lead to greater stability, at least in the short and medium term. Whether or not that's the case in the long term, I think is a separate question.
I do totally agree with what you've said. Well, if I can quote that, what you said is the cultural exchange through the digitalization is making the relation between government to governments like thicker, right? But then when we look at the recent event in Russia, so can we say like there is any advantage for that, or like rather, is there anything that worsen the relation between the EU and Russia, or like between Russia and Ukraine and itself through digitalization of their diplomacy?
So, I mean, obviously, just with the case of Russia and Ukraine, I mean, this is perhaps not exactly digital diplomacy, but it is use of digital tools. Russia, did of course carry out cyber attacks in the in the opening phases and even throughout the rest of the ongoing hot conflict that's taking place in Ukraine. Russia is a particularly problematic and malign actor in this regard. I mentioned earlier, Russia has used just very recently some extremely inflammatory video imagery, imagining what a Russian nuclear attack on San Francisco and New York would look like. I mean, that's clearly intended to be a threatening message to the United States and Europe, that there are red lines that that Russia sets, in terms of what it says it's willing to accept, in terms of U.S. and European support for Ukraine in this war. Whether or not one considers that to be destabilizing or stabilizing is, I think, a separate question. But I think nonetheless, we are seeing that be used, and obviously, it simply drags down relations between Europe and Moscow even more than they already were. In addition to that, of course, Russia uses digital tools, notably for disinformation campaigns. And so obviously this is one other diplomatic tool that Russia has always, or even during the Soviet period and into the Russian period, has always had it as at its disposal. And this disinformation, use of digital media for disinformation campaigns, of course, it flows on the back of Twitter. It flows on the back of Instagram and of TikTok and Facebook. So Russia uses social media in this regard. That's in addition to other tools such as its television channels, which are of course also available digitally and over the web, and are clearly diplomatic propaganda arms of the Kremlin in order to sow confusion and misinformation and false narratives or misleading and distracting narratives in Western countries, whether that be in Western Europe or in the United States. I think the bigger picture here is that those digital diplomatic tools fit into a larger strategy that Russia has used against Europe with some success at various points that we call hybrid threats or hybrid warfare, which is to say essentially trying to degrade and wear down the resistance to low level, below the threshold of kinetic attack warfare, so that states or the European Union as such no longer sufficiently defend themselves against the demands of what Russia wants. So far that hasn't really paid off in a big way, although Russia has had some pretty significant success in this regard in getting influence within certain right-wing parties in Europe. And it will be an interesting question going forward to see to what degree the use of digital diplomacy as a part of a larger hybrid warfare campaign against the West within the context of the hot conflict in Ukraine might wear down support in Europe for Ukraine going forward, or for that matter in the United States as well. So I think that's something that's going on. Just one last thing about disinformation. I think what's important really to remember about disinformation is that disinformation isn't necessarily, or in fact, even in the first place, and in some cases at all, about trying to achieve positive uptake of an alternative narrative. Disinformation can function, and in many cases, primarily is intended to function as a way to undermine the very concept of political truth or political objectivity in the first place.
Thank you very much. You mentioned the risks and opportunities of using digital tools in diplomacy. So what trends do you see on the horizon for digital diplomacy? How might, in the future, digital diplomacy affect politics and policies given this new advent of artificial intelligence?
That was actually the first thing that I was going to say was about artificial intelligence. I mean, again, I'll back up and I'll say, and just repeat this. What ultimately is important in the use of digital diplomacy as a tool of national power is a national strategy and a message, a coherent message that is tailored to fit that strategy. So, the first trend I see, unfortunately, is that states are not getting better, in my estimation, at putting together coherent national strategies. So, I foresee a continuation of the trend of a sort of strategic aimlessness among a lot of states. And it doesn't matter, what type of band-aid of digital diplomacy you put on top of that. You're still not going to have a coherent, outcome if you don't have a coherent national strategy and message behind it. So I think that's one thing I see. Obviously the other major trend is that just like most other things in life, we shouldn't extrapolate in a way that's linear, but at least more or less in the same direction. Path dependency takes over, and much of what we've seen before is what we're going to continue to see going forward, right? So the use of social networks, the use of social media as a way for governments to broadcast their position. We'll see an increasing, I think, use of that. It will, of course, be something that becomes increasingly more more employed as a tool by states that haven't done it until now, or states that haven't done it as aggressively as other states have. So I think we'll see a more uniformization of the use of these digital tools. As I said, I think we're going to see an increasing increasing difficulty with dealing with disinformation, which comes out of the use of the negative use or the problematic use of some of these digital diplomacy tools, which are so good at producing large volumes of misinformation in the public sphere. And then, of course, with artificial intelligence, I think we're going to end up having an increasing problem, and we're already seeing it, of course, with the use of deep fakes. And so states are going to have a tougher and tougher time trying to convince populations that the things that they see are actually happening, whether those be good things or bad things. And conversely, states are going to have a harder time convincing populations that things that they are seeing didn't in fact take place. And this to some degree fits into the larger discussion about flooding the zone with disinformation. Obviously artificial intelligence, which is used in this malign fashion to create images that didn't exist, it's going to compromise the ability of states to convince populations that things that have taken place really did take place, and the reverse, things that didn't take place didn't take place. So I think this is another trend that we're going to see going forward, and this is a huge challenge, and it's one that is partially going to be rooted in good governance. States ultimately will have an easier time getting through the problems of the digital domain disinformation if states can be seen as delivering on the other things that people need, right? If states are considered to be relatively transparent, if they're considered to be relatively competent, if they're considered to be relatively fair, if they deliver for their populations, then it will be easier to fight through the problems that artificial intelligence, notably, for instance, through deepfakes, can bring about in the digital domain. If governments are considered to be corrupt, if they're considered to be ineffective, if they're considered to be incompetent, then obviously, even when governments are right and they say X actually happened or Y didn't happen, that it will be harder for them to make that claim persuasive, because they won't have the reputation that gives them the benefit of the doubt.
I would like also to talk about the prospective opportunity, perhaps. Are there emerging technologies or platforms that you think could reshape the digital diplomacy landscape?
I mean, the thing that stands out right offhand is probably quantum computing, because quantum computing is tremendously important for encryption technology, and so this represents a tremendous potential risk to the ability of states to carry out secret diplomatic communications. One of the fundamental elements of diplomacy is that your diplomats abroad and the intelligence agents that you have abroad use secure encrypted cables, as they call them, cables. I mean, it used to actually be a cable. I guess today it's a different type of cable, probably fiber optic. These encrypted cables, allow for safe passage of information from secret information from your diplomats and your intelligence agents back to their consumers and their home governments. Quantum computing puts at risk the cryptography behind that. And so as a new technology, we're still some ways away from quantum computing being able to engage in the prime factorization upon which most of cryptography is built. Essentially the way it works is that messages are encrypted with long strings of numbers, and the decryption code involves finding the prime factors of these extremely long series of numbers. Traditional computers aren't particularly great at this prime factorization task, but quantum computers can be. They aren't yet currently ready. They're working at something like, I think, 400 to 500 qubits or something like that, which is still a relatively meager number. But once we get into the thousands or the low tens of thousands in terms of the number of qubits that quantum computers can employ, then we'll be looking at the ability of these quantum computers to begin to decrypt extremely large numbers through this prime factorization process. And that's going to put at risk our entire traditional paradigm for secret diplomatic messaging. And so I think that's an emerging technology that's clearly on the radar in countries that have supercomputer and quantum computer programs, such as the United States, China, the European Union, Japan, Korea, India.
Thank you very much. So everyone, thank you so much for watching this podcast. And in today's podcast, we had already discussed about why digital diplomacy is significant in politics and policy. We already touched about the background of the knowledge from the definitions, and also we touched as well some how the impacts of the influence of the digital diplomacy for the security and stability of the countries, and how particular country use the digital for their own benefits. And also we talk about the emerging technologies such as the quantum diplomacy. Thank you very much. And also Jevon, thank you for facilitating us today. And let's see again for the next podcast. Thank you. Bye-bye.